Before we begin, please note that this episode includes discussions of graphic violence, poverty, and harsh living conditions. It may also contain outdated terms relevant to the times discussed. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome back to London's Dark Archives, where we continue our exploration of the Whitechapel murders, a series of gruesome killings that have haunted the streets of East London since 1888. Today we delve into one of the most interesting and harrowing nights in this dark chapter, the night of the double event. On September 30th, 1888, two women were brutally murdered in the space of a single hour, an event that sent shockwaves through an already terrified community. But was this truly the work of one killer? Or could it be that the heightened media attention, fear and tension of the time created a spotlight on Whitechapel, making it seem more dangerous than it actually was? Just as in modern times, where the proliferation of digital and social media often makes the world feel more dangerous than ever, it's possible that the Jack the Ripper story was a similar phenomenon, an intense, magnified glimpse into the horrors of 1888. Was this really the work of a single madman, or a series of grim coincidences in a crime-ridden area suddenly thrust into the public eye? In the weeks leading up to the double event, the East End of London was gripped by fear. The murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman had already sent ripples through the community, but the local press played a significant role in amplifying the terror. The newspapers were full of sensational headlines, each more lurid than the last. The Star and the Illustrated Police News were particularly notorious, churning out stories that soaked fear and paranoia among the residents. People of Whitechapel were terrified to walk the streets at night, especially the women. The police too were under immense pressure, criticising the press for their inability to catch the killer. Statements from residents reflected a community on the edge. One woman, whose statement was published in the Times, described how she now feared leaving her house after dark. Another man claimed the police presence, rather than providing reassurance, only heightened his anxiety. Elizabeth Stride, the first victim of the double event, was an interesting and complex character. Born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden 1843, she moved to London in 1866. Like many of the women who fell victim to Jack the Ripper, Liz Stride lived a hard life, marked by poverty and instability. She had a reputation as a tough, independent woman who worked as a cleaner, a seamstress, but also occasionally turned to prostitution to make ends meet. On the night of her murder, Liz Stride was seen in various locations across Whitechapel. She was spotted at the Bricklayers Arms pub on Settle Street at about 11 p.m, and later at the corner of Burner Street and Fairclough Street, where she was seen talking to a man. Burner Street was a dark, narrow road typical of the East End at the time, and it was here, in Duckfield's yard, that Liz Stride would meet her end. What makes Liz Stride's case particularly intriguing is the meeting that was taking place in the nearby International Working Men's Educational Club. This socialist club was a hub for the local immigrant population, especially Jewish and Eastern European residents. On the night of September 29th, a discussion on the state of socialism was being held, and the yard where Stride was murdered was adjacent to this very meeting. The juxtaposition of such a political and intellectual gathering with the brutal, primal violence of Stride's murder is striking. One of the key witnesses in the case of Liz Stride was a man called Israel Schwartz, a Hungarian Jew who lived in the area. His testimony has been the subject of much debate amongst ripperologists. Schwartz claimed to have seen a man attacking Stride at around 12:45 a.m. He described the attacker as about 5 foot 5 inches tall, with a fair complexion, dark hair and a small brown moustache. He was wearing a black cap and a dark overcoat. Schwartz also mentioned the man shouted a word often interpreted as Lipski, a common slur against Jews at the time. It was either directed at him or another man who seemed to be watching the scene. This second man followed Schwartz, and so fearing for his safety, Schwartz fled and did not intervene. But here's where it gets complicated. Was this attack the fatal one? Or was Stride attacked twice that night? The details are murky, but what we do know is the body was discovered by Louis Diemschutz, the steward of the Working Man's Club, at about 1 a.m. Diemschutz was driving his pony and cart into the yard when his horse shied away, sensing something unusual in the dark. When Diemschutz investigated, he found Stride's body lying in the yard, her throat freshly cut but no other mutilations. Was the Ripper interrupted? Was Diemschutz himself in danger? Another thought. Should Diemschutz be suspected? Well, that's food for thought. Less than an hour later, the killer would strike again, this time in the heart of the city of London. Catherine Eddowes, the second victim of the double event, had a long and troubled history. Born in Wolverhampton in 1842, Eddowes was a strong-willed woman known for her sharp wit and intelligence. However, her life was marred by poverty and alcoholism, much like the other victims. She had lived in various parts of London, including Southwark and Spitalfields, and was known to the local authorities for her frequent run-ins with the law. On the night of September 29th, Eddowes was arrested for drunkenness and spent several hours in the cells at Bishopsgate Police Station. She was released around 1 a.m. on September the 30th and was last seen alive at 1:35 by three men near Mitre Square. At around 1:45 a.m, PC Edward Watkins, on his regular beat, discovered her mutilated body in Mitre Square. Mitre Square in 1888 was a small, quiet area nestled between tall, imposing buildings. Unlike the cramped, chaotic streets of Whitechapel, Mitre Square was part of the City of London. For those of you who don't know, London is a massive city at around 50 miles across. Within the centre is the City of London, a 1 square mile area known to locals just as the City. It's a place of business and relative order. To the east side of the city bleeds into the East End of London. There is a visible border, but only a trained eye can spot that. Mitre Square was bordered by a school, warehouses and an entrance to St James's Passage, a narrow alley leading to Church Place. This was an area where one could easily disappear into the shadows, and the square itself provided a chillingly secluded spot for the killer to carry out his horrific crime. The murder of Catherine Eddowes was particularly brutal. Her throat had been deeply slashed and her face horribly mutilated, with cuts to her eyelids, nose and cheeks. Her abdomen was laid open and several organs, including a kidney, had been removed. The level of violence in Eddowes' murder suggested the killer was escalating, possibly frustrated by the lack of opportunity to mutilate Stride. Mitre Square holds a personal connection for me. Working in the City of London in the 1990s, I discovered this dark history. Walking through the alleyways that once led from this infamous square, the area had changed significantly since 1888, but it still retained the original layout, and it was still quite run down. It still had an alleyway leading out to Church, so you could almost walk into Jack's World. Mitre Square has been modernised twice since then, and is now completely unrecognisable. Only the school that was a border remains. After the murder of Catherine Eddowes, the killer made his way eastward into Whitechapel, where he left behind a crucial bit of evidence. A portion of Eddowes' blood-stained apron was found in Galston Street, in a doorway leading to a tenement building. Above it, written in chalk, was a piece of graffiti that read, "The Jews, or Jewess, are the man that will not be blamed for nothing." This graffiti has sparked endless debate. Was it written by Jack the Ripper, or was it a mere coincidence it was found near the apron? We don't don't actually know exactly what was said. The message was quickly erased by the police, who feared it would incite anti-Semitic riots in the already tense area. And what we have now is what an officer had written down from what he could remember. This decision has been criticised by some as a case of police placing racial relations above public safety, an echo of more recent times, such as the failures in Rotherham, where similar concerns were prioritised over the protection of victims and the public. By the time of the double event, the letter-writing phenomenon associated with Ripper murders had reached fever pitch. The most famous of these letters is the one signed Jack the Ripper, received by the Central News Agency on September 27th, just 3 days before the double event. In this letter, the author taunted the police, boasting of his murderous intentions and his skill with a knife. The chilling signature, Jack the Ripper, would forever link these crimes in the public imagination, cementing the killer's place in history. The letters didn't stop there. On October 1st, the day after the double event, another letter was received. This one even more macabre. It was dubbed the Saucy Jackie postcard. In it, the author claimed responsibility for both murders, referring to them as the double event and gloating about his work. The postcard stated, "I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time." Whether these letters were genuinely from the killer or work of a morbid hoaxer remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. But what is undeniable is the impact they had on investigation and on public fear. The name Jack the Ripper would now become synonymous with terror. The police, already under immense pressure, intensified their efforts following the double event. The Metropolitan Police, under Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, and the City of London Police, led by James McWilliam, were both investigating. But the jurisdictional boundaries between Whitechapel and the city complicated matters. The murder of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square brought the City of London and police into the investigation, and the lack of coordination between these two forces led to inefficiencies and missed opportunities. One of the most prominent suspects at the time was John Pizer, also known as Leather Apron, who we covered in an earlier episode. He was arrested on September 10th, 1888, shortly after Annie Chapman's murder, but had solid alibis for the nights of the murders and was soon released. Despite his innocence, Pizer's arrest fueled anti-Semitic sentiment in the area, adding to the already charged atmosphere. Another suspect was Michael Kidney, a local man who had been in a tumultuous relationship with Liz Stride. Known for his violent temper, Kidney was questioned by the police but was eventually released without charge. The focus then shifted back to the unknown figure who had evaded capture so far, the shadowy figure who would later be immortalised as Jack the Ripper. Following the double event, the atmosphere in the East End reached fever pitch. The community was gripped by panic, and the press only added fuel to the fire. Headlines screamed of the Whitechapel fiend and the murder most horrible, stoking fear and speculation. The streets of Whitechapel were patrolled by an increasing police presence, but this did little to reassure the frightened residents. Vigilance committees were formed by local citizens, taking the law into their own hands as trust in the authorities waned. The public outcry was enormous, with people demanding the police do more to protect the community. The failure to apprehend the killer led to widespread criticism of the police, particularly Sir Charles Warren, who would later resign from his position as Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police under a cloud of controversy. Now, let's take a moment to reflect on the events of that fateful night. In my view, it's highly likely the same killer attacked both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. The fact that Stride's body was found with no additional mutilations suggests the killer was interrupted, possibly by Deemster's arrival, forcing him to flee before completing his grisly work. Frustrated and driven by his dark compulsions, the killer then sought out another victim, finding the secluded Mitre Square to be the perfect location to carry out his horrific deeds. I also find the timing discrepancies reported by the police and the night watchman to be suspicious. It's quite possible the men on duty that night were not entirely truthful in their statements, either to cover for a lapse in vigilance or simply out of fear of the consequences. This may have given the killer more time than initially thought, allowing him to complete his ghastly work. As for the graffiti in Golston Street, I'm inclined to believe it was a coincidence, an unrelated scrawl that just happened to be near the piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron. But the fact the police erased it out of concern for inciting anti-Semitic violence shows how racial tensions were a significant issue, one that they deemed more pressing than preserving the potential evidence. This night, more than any other in the Whitechapel murder series, is packed with so many layers of intrigue, horror and tragedy. It offers us a glimpse into the psyche of the killer and the desperate, fear-stricken world of those who lived in the East End at the time. While it's fascinating to dive into the details, it's also important to remember the human cost of these crimes. These were real women, with lives and stories who met untimely and violent ends. Before we conclude, I'd like to recommend a series that offers a different perspective on these events. The Five by Ali Rubinold. It focuses on the lives of the victims rather than the killer, providing a much needed shift in narrative that emphasises their humanity. As the fog rolls in over the East End, the spectre of Jack the Ripper looms large. The events of September the 30th, 1888 remain some of the most disturbing and perplexing in the history of crime. But the tale of the Whitechapel murders is far from over. In our next episode, we'll explore the continued terror that gripped London as the killer remained large. Stay with us as we uncover more of London's dark archives. Thank you for listening to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most chilling mysteries. Until next time, stay safe, keep your doors locked.